Hello everybody, welcome to another session in HPSG. In the last few videos we have looked at how meaning can be constructed in HPSG. Particularly we have looked at semantic features and we have formulated two principles, semantic inheritance principle and semantic compositionality principle. In this video we are going to look at another topic, binding theory, where we are going to look at co-reference between two elements in a sentence. We will begin with certain binding facts and then we will have feature-based descriptions of reflexives and non-reflexives. Then we are going to have a new feature argument structure. After that we will formalize binding principles to account for co-reference between elements in a sentence. Let's look at the binding facts. Look at the sentences given in this slide. The first sentence is Susan likes herself, where you have herself is a reflexive which is co-indexed with Susan. Co-indexation is given by subscript. So I and I tells us that herself refers to Susan. Susan likes her is ungrammatical sentence. We know that it is ungrammatical because there is a star before the sentence. Because this sentence is ungrammatical because her and Susan are co-indexed. That is, we do not want the word her to refer to Susan. Without co-reference, the sentence will be alright. Right? Okay, then look at the next sentence. Susan told herself a story, where herself is a reflexive and refers to Susan. So the word Susan is the antecedent for this reflexive, as in the previous sentences. Similarly, in the same position, you cannot have a pronoun. So reflexive, wherever a reflexive pronoun occurs, a pronoun doesn't occur. They are in complementary distribution. That's what we are going to see in the next few sentences too. Susan told her story to herself. Herself is reflexive and the antecedent is Susan, and their two are co-indexed. Susan told a story to her is ungrammatical when the word her refers to Susan. That is, the co-indexation is ungrammatical. Susan devoted herself to linguistics. Again, reflexive herself is co-indexed with the antecedent Susan. Susan devoted her to linguistics is ungrammatical. Nobody told Susan about herself. Here, herself is co-indexed with Susan. Remember, note that herself is not co-indexed with the subject here. In the previous sentences 1 to 4, we see that the reflexive is co-indexed with the subject, whereas here the reflexive is co-indexed with the object. However, what we see is nobody told Susan about her is ungrammatical. That is, in 1 to 5, what we see is wherever the word herself occurs, her cannot occur. In all these sentences, what we also see is both the word herself and the antecedent are the arguments of the verb. See, Susan likes herself. Like is a verb and likes specifier is Susan and complement is herself. So these two are arguments of the same verb. In fact, you cannot say herself likes Susan, which is ungrammatical, because the antecedent should precede the reflexive. So what we understand from here is the reflexive should always follow. That is, the reflexive which is co-indexed with the antecedent should precede the reflexive, though they belong to the same verb, though both of them are arguments of the same verb. Look at 6. Susan thinks that nobody likes herself. Here, herself is the reflexive. It is co-indexed with Susan, but it is ungrammatical because herself and Susan are not the arguments of the verb like. Susan is the specifier of think and herself is the object of or complement of the verb like. So what we understand from this sentence is that both the antecedent and the reflexive should be co-arguments or arguments of the same verb. In fact, if you replace herself with her, it is ungrammatical, right? It is ungrammatical because her is the object of like and Susan is the subject of think. They are not co-arguments. What we see here is both the antecedent and the reflexive must be co-arguments, whereas the pronoun and its antecedent cannot be the arguments of the same verb. Look at the next sentence. Susan's friends like herself. Here, herself is a reflexive. Susan is part of the subject. It is not the subject, right? The subject of the sentence is Susan's friends. So Susan is part of the subject. So it cannot be the argument of the verb like. Hence, Susan cannot be the antecedent for herself, right? Whereas, as we know, as we have seen earlier, herself, reflexive and pronouns are complementary distribution. So you can have a pronoun here which can refer to Susan, because Susan is not the co-argument of her. Similarly, that picture of Susan offended herself, where Susan cannot be the antecedent of herself because Susan is not a co-argument of the verb of the reflexive herself. That is, Susan and herself are not arguments of the same verb, right? Susan is the complement of the preposition of, whereas herself is the complement of the verb offend. And in place of herself, we can use the verb, the pronoun her. So what we understand from these is that a reflexive pronoun must be bound by a preceding argument of the same verb. Remember, preceding argument of the same verb. Whereas a non-reflexive pronoun may not be bound by a preceding argument of the same verb. We are saying may not be bound by a preceding argument of the same verb. So they are in complementary distribution. Wherever reflexive occurs, pronoun cannot occur, or wherever a pronoun occurs, reflexive cannot occur. Okay, and we have a restriction now, co-argument restriction. Okay, this is very informal. We need to formalize this. How are we going to formalize this? These principles. That's why we are calling these principles version 1. Let's have a description of the reflexives first. In order to describe a reflexive in terms of features, we will have to introduce a new feature called anaphor, in short ANA, to distinguish reflexive pronouns from non-reflexive pronouns. So what we are saying is a reflexive pronoun has a plus anaphor feature, whereas a non-reflexive pronoun has minus anaphor feature. So that's how we are going to distinguish between reflexive and non-reflexive pronouns. In addition, we'll also assume that reciprocals. What are reciprocals? The word like each other or one another, they are reciprocals. They also have a feature called anaphor plus. Whereas other non-pronominal NPs, that is, you have your names, proper nouns, or definite expressions, etc., they are all anaphor minus. Okay, so anaphor is a feature we are introducing to distinguish reflexives from other pronouns and noun phrases. Then, since ANA specifications must percolate up from the head noun, right? That is, a word like reflexive, like herself or himself, has ANA feature, which is plus, but that has to go up to the NP which it projects. How can it percolate? Only through a principle we know, head feature principle. So what we'll say is the ANA feature should be part of head feature. Only then the ANA specification can percolate up from the head noun to NP. Right? So with this description, let's see the lexical entries. You have lexical entry like yourself. The word yourself is a reflexive. And when you look at its lexical entry, we have, remember, we have had two features, syntax features and semantic features. We are not mentioning semantic features in this slide because we don't have anything to do with the semantics now. So yourself has a syntactic features. Its head value is a noun. Its head value is noun, and it has two features: AGR feature, and AGR has feature structure, person, number feature, second and singular. In addition to this, we have introduced now Anna, which is plus. Right? So syntax of yourself has head feature. We haven't added specifier and the complements here. Okay, we are under specifying now for the moment, but we need to mention that later anyway. So semantic features and specifier and complex features, we are not giving them right now. Now when you look at a pronoun which is not reflexive, it's a non-reflexive pronoun. It has syntax head value noun and case accusative. Agreement, you have person, number, third and plural. Along with what we see is anaphoric feature is minus, right? In contrast with the reflexive yourself, the anaphoric feature is minus here. And when you look at a name, which is again a non-reflexive, it's a non-pronominal too. It's not a pronominal. So what are its features? Its head value is noun and it has its own AGR features. Then anaphor feature is minus. So only categories or only words which have anaphor plus are reflexives, and as we said, each other and one another reciprocals. Now let's incorporate this into the HVSG. How are we going to formalize the preceding argument of the same verb? In the binding principles we have used preceding argument of the same verb. We need to formalize this because this is very informal now. What do you mean by preceding, or what do you mean by argument of the same verb, right? We need to formalize this. What are the arguments of a verb? We see that there is a specifier for each. If it is a transitive verb, there is a specifier and there are comps. There is one complement at least. So for verbs we have specifier and comps. Those are the arguments, but they are not linearly ordered. If you remember your structure, a feature structure for a verb, you have specifier as a feature and comps as another feature, right? Like if you have specifier and comps here, you'll have specifier here which is empty, comps here which is empty, right? But not linearly ordered. They're not linearly ordered. So binding between, and also we have seen that binding is between specifier and non-subjects, particularly 1 to 4 of the sentences which you have given, except in 1. And also we need to note that complements in the comp list are ordered. Though we didn't say it explicitly, the complements, if you have two complements in a comp list, for example, in a ditransitive verb, when you say John gave Mary an apple, so Mary and an apple are two NPs. They are ordered in the comps of the verb give. So there is an order only in the comps list, but not between specifier and comps. And we also need binding between subject and non-subjects. So we have to relate them. So to address this problem, to address this issue, we posit a new list valued feature. We are adding a new feature which has lists as its value. The feature is called argument structure, or in short argst, right? Argument structure is a feature. What does it contain? It contains the sum of specifier value and comps value. Sum, remember, in semantic compositionality principle we have used the word sum there with a symbol plus. Same thing happens here too. So we are going to put the specifier value and comps value together, which makes argument structure. That is, the subject and the complements are put together in the argument structure, right? In the argument structure we are going to put both subject and complements. That we call a principle. The principle is called argument realization principle. It's a preliminary version. We are going to modify it later. What is the argument relation principle, or in short ARP or ARP? What does it say? It says a word's value for argument structure is A plus B. A plus B. What is A? A is its value for specifier and B is its value for comps. Right? A is for specifier value and B comps value. We are putting them together. That's the sum plus. So A plus B. That is the value of argument structure, right, of a word. So by that principle, by the argument relation principle, the subject synsem structure is the first member of the verb's argument structure list. Right? What does it mean? We know in feature structure for a word, we have specifier and comps. The specifier is actually the subject of the verb. If it's a verb, we take a verb's entry, lexical entry. Specifier is the subject and comps are the objects. When we say specifier is the subject, whatever subject's feature structure or synsem structure is same as synsem structure of the specifier of the verb, right? And the synsem structure of the specifier is again indexed or co-indexed with the first element on the argument structure. That means synsem structure of the subject is same as synsem structure of the specifier. Synsem structure of the specifier is same as synsem structure of the first element of the argument structure, right? That means synsem structure of the subject is same as the synsem structure of the first element of argument structure. That's what we are saying here. Okay. Similarly, the objects synsem structures are same as the other elements in the argument structures. Synsem of the arguments, other elements of the argument structures. Once the distinctions relevant to binding theory are encoded by whatever means in the feature structures of the reflexive and non-reflexive NPs, the same information will be present in the argument structure of the lexical head of the sentence, where the binding principles can be enforced. So, what we have seen is now in a comps, we have a complement that matches with the synsem structure of the word, the object. Let's say the object here is a reflexive. The object is a reflexive. So, in its synsem structure, we have anaphor plus. So, the comps value here will also have anaphor plus. And that is transferred here again. Right? So, that is transferred here to the object, right, to the object. So what we are saying is, once we decide on the distinction between an anaphor and a non-anaphor, that distinction will be expressed in the argument structure, right? That is, the same information which we have in the object is present here on the argument structure. So, if this is a reflexive and this is a subject, we need to have binding principles applying here, right? Where will you use the binding principle? We will use the binding principle on the argument structure. Okay, we do not have any structure or destructure as we saw it in Chomsky syntax. So the binding principles apply on the argument structure. So the argument structure principle is very important, and argument structure principle is relevant only to words only to words. Though the argument structure principle, right, ARP, argument relation principle, ARP is like valence principle, but it's not the same. Valence principle, basically what it does is to keep track of the elements that an expression needs. So suppose a verb has a specifier and a comps. When the verb attaches to a comps, the comps list becomes empty. And when the verb phrase attaches to a specifier, the specifier value becomes empty on the mother node, and the comps list, which is empty already, is transferred. This is maintained by your valence principle, right? It looks at the arguments and the combination with specifiers and complements. Whereas argument relation principle does not change the argument structure of words. Okay, look at this, the feature which we have added, and the argument structure, the list here is sum of this and this. And when the verb, let's say this is a verb hit, and hit combines with a complement with an object himself, then this becomes empty when it is VP, but this will not become empty. This will not be removed. Argument structure remains the same throughout. What changes here, is only the specifier and comps, not in the argument structure. Right? That's how argument relation principle is different from valence principle. And where is the argument structure feature? It is not part of the head. Right? It's not part of the head. It is not part of syntax. It is on par with syntax. Right? You have syntax and argument structure. Then you will have semantics. Okay, we haven't given the semantics here. So syn, argument structure, and sem. Argument structure is on par with syntax and semantics. Now, argument structure is a feature we only find in lexical heads, not anywhere. And ordering of the elements in its value imposes a ranking on the phrases in the phrase structure that correspond to those elements. So you have two elements here in the argument structure. So this is preceding this. That means this is 1, this is 2. There is a ranking. Right? 1 and 2 indices, of course, but there is also ranking that this is higher than this. Similarly, if you have 3 arguments and this NP is higher than this PP and this is higher than this VP. Okay, so the order in which the arguments are represent the ranking value. So a phrase A outranks a phrase B just in case A's synsem structure precedes B's synsem structure on some argument structure list. You have an argument structure list in which there is an A and there is a B. A is one synsem structure, B is another synsem structure. Then A's synsem structure is preceding B's, so A outranks B. That's what this means. Now, based on these, now we will formulate our binding principles. Right? Principle A and principle B, earlier we had given only an informal definition. Now look at this. This is version 2. A reflexive pronoun of an argument structure list must be outranked by a coindexed element. Must be outranked by a coindexed element. So you have, let's say this is reflexive. This can be coindexed with this NP because this outranks. If the reflexive is here, this cannot be coindexed with this because this the second NP doesn't outrank the first one. Similarly, if you have an NP here in the PP and NP here, this NP outranks this PP. So you can have a reflexive in it, which can be co-indexed with it. So ranking is important for us to co-index. Principle B can be changed to a non-reflexive pronoun of an argument structure list must not be outranked by a co-indexed element. Here it is must be outranked. Here we are saying must not be outranked, so that we get the complementarity between reflexive pronouns and non-reflexive pronouns. So what have we looked at here in this video? We have seen binding facts, where we said a reflexive can be co-indexed with an argument of the same verb, right? And what we're saying is the argument, which is the antecedent, should precede the reflexive, and reflexive and pronoun are complementary. Then that's what we have seen in the preliminary version of binding theory. Then we added a new feature called anaphor, and reflexives have that feature as plus and non-reflexive pronouns have minus. Similarly, reciprocals like each other and one another have plus anaphor feature, and ordinary non-pronominal NPs, that is any names, will have negative value of anaphor feature. And this anaphor feature should be part of head feature, because that feature should percolate to the noun phrase. Only then we can have co-indexing properly. Then we have seen the lexical entries where the reflexives have anaphor plus and non-reflexive have anaphor minus. In order to formalize the statement preceding argument of the same verb, we have introduced a new feature called argument structure list, which is nothing but specifiers and comps together. So we have got a principle called argument relation principle, which gives the value for argument structure feature. Argument structure feature you get as a sum of the specifier and comps. We needed this because earlier specifier and comps are not linearly ordered, and we need linear ordering to explain binding facts. Then by argument relation principle, we are able to co-index the NP, that is which has a reflexive or anaphor plus feature, with its antecedent. So we finally defined our principles as these, where a reflexive pronoun of an argument structure list must be outranked by a co-indexed element, and non-reflexive pronoun of an argument structure list must not be outranked by a co-indexed element. See you in the next video.